Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed our discussion during our first half of our afternoon program. Next, we'll be having our North Korea panel, moderated by our Chairman David Pong, who will be introducing our speaker. Chairman Pong.
All right. At the first session, my colleagues and Dean Goodman and Gordon Flake really made a very important and interesting presentations and comments, and I deeply appreciate what they have done. Let me introduce, it's a great pleasure to introduce one of my good friends, Evans Revere, who is with the Albright Stonebridge group, but actually he's better known as the president of Korea Society or acting Secretary of State for East Asia or Pacific.
You keep promoting me.
Well, a senior deputy assistant. I promoted one guy too.
I know.
Did you know him? Okay. Anyway, I'm very glad to have this top expert on North Korea, especially Evan Revere. And also, let's give him a big hand first. Evans.
Thank you very much.
And a couple of my colleagues who are with me, is incumbent journalist. Actually, the incumbent president, publisher of one of the largest newspaper in Korea, Chosun Weekly. He used to be a managing editor, now president, publisher of the Chosun Weekly publication. Kim Chang-gi. How can I? And one of my best friend who used to be the president of Yonhap News. It's like a UPI or Associated Press here. He rather chose Associated Press. But only a few weeks ago, he was the president of that, and he sort of resigned voluntarily. Pak, what is your name? Pak Jung-Chan. Yeah. Okay. And I want to make just a little bit of an additional comment as to why we had to inaugurate this kind of club called the Korean American Club, Hanmi Club. As I told you before, we who used to work for the vernacular newspapers in Washington as a Washington correspondent went back to Korea and saw a lot of youngsters who don't understand the situation and history of a Korean-American alliance came out on the street to demonstrate and chanting slogans, anti-Yankee go home, anti-American slogans. So with all that, we sort of got together and decided to do something. We are the members of the Kwannon Press Club, and I'm the 20th president over there. And the first president was right there. Charlie Chin has gone home. He used to be bureau chief of Associated Press in Seoul, who was elected as Kwannon Press Club president. So we sort of senior journalists got together to organize this kind of the club, so that we would try to be of some help in enhancing the understanding between two great peoples, as well as promoting the already bridgehead alliance between the United States and Korea. That's why we're here to talk about the future of Korean-American friendship, as well as better understanding between two peoples. And so I had the pleasure of inviting half Korean like Evans Revere to present his case on this the prospect for U.S.-Korea cooperation on Korea. It's microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of you for being here, and a special thanks to the Hanmi Club for your initiative in making this wonderful event possible. and for all the great work that you have done over the years on behalf of the U.S.-Korea relationship. Many of those demonstrators that you referred to a few moments ago were camped outside the embassy that I was part of a few years ago, so I know of what you speak personally and at considerable volume. And I also know well the great work that you've done to improve the situation between our two countries to the point where we have the incredible relationship that we have today. Also, a word of thanks to KEI. I'm a big fan of what you do, and I appreciate the great work that you've done in making this event possible today. And thanks to both organizations for your timeliness, if you will, in selecting today to do this. Needless to say, we are living in fascinating times in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula in particular. We've been through a very difficult and occasionally disturbing and frightening few weeks in dealing with North Korea. But we've also been through a superbly managed visit by President Park, who is an old personal friend of mine. And it was obvious during her visit here that she has lots of friends and supporters in the United States. I'm supposed to talk about the prospects for U.S.-Korea cooperation in dealing with North Korea. I'm always nervous doing that in the presence of so many journalists because during my days as a diplomat, I was usually on the receiving end of their tough questions, and I can show you my scars later on. But I think it's a much friendlier gathering today, so I feel very comforted by that. And since I no longer work for the government, I can say what I think. Freedom is a wonderful thing. It's already been said that President Park's visit was tremendously successful, and that's not just Washington spin. I managed to talk to a number of friends in the current administration, and they were raving about the outcome of that visit. And so clearly, some very, very good things happened, not the least of which was, in my view, one of the most important outcomes of the summit, which was the establishment of a really good rapport, chemistry, between the two leaders. Anyone who's familiar with summitry between any two countries knows how important it is to get the chemistry right between the two leaders, and there's no question in my mind that the chemistry between President Obama and President Park is there, and it will help the two countries really move forward on a whole range of issues in the coming months and the coming years. There was also, I think, a very significant comfort level, if that's the right word, in terms of the President's view of the South Korean game plan going forward on the issue that we're talking about in this panel, which is North Korea. South Korea's new president, President Park, has written extensively and spoke extensively during her campaign about the need to reach out to North Korea, about to build a relationship of trust, if possible, between South and North, and to try to jumpstart, if you will, dialogue between South and North. And that's something that I think President Obama and his administration feel very comfortable with. And so she had an opportunity to speak to the Congress. She had an opportunity, obviously, to speak to the President and his entire senior leadership of his administration about her game plan going forward. And I think people are very supportive of that. There's an understanding, I think, of why President Park desires to try to re-engage the North, at a minimum, to try to reduce tensions on the peninsula, also to try to move the relationship with North Korea in a different direction than it's been moving in the last few years. And as I suggested a moment ago, there was also an understanding of how committed she was during her campaign to following this course of action, and I think Washington is willing to see what can be done to help her in this respect. There's also an understanding in Washington of a very basic fact that is all too often forgotten when we're talking about Korea. The name of the peninsula is the Korean Peninsula, and it makes eminent sense for Koreans to try to take the lead and see what can be done to move the relationship in a better direction. And since there is a tremendous level of trust and confidence on the part of Washington in our South Korean allies and in President Park herself, I think that has helped solidify, if you will, Washington's support for the notion of Korea sort of going first, if you will, and trying to deal with the North. The previous Korean president, Lee Myung-bak, also a good friend, who also had a very good relationship with President Obama, had also sought to put South Korea in the lead. Unfortunately, North Korea had a very different idea and rejected his various overtures very, very strongly. And unfortunately, the South-North relationship did not move in a very positive direction during that time. And I think the bulk of responsibility lies in Pyongyang, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the question and answer period if you'd like. But I think nevertheless it's important to try again for no other reason than to keep the pressure on North Korea and to remind everybody where the intransigence lies. If any party is going to bring the relationship to a halt or is going to move things in a negative direction, let's make sure it's North Korea and not South Korea. So all the more reason to keep the heat on Pyongyang. But we also ought to manage our expectations, I think, in dealing with North Korea. Looking around the room, there are many veterans of this process of dealing with North Korea, directly or indirectly, and we all know how often we've been disappointed in the past. It is, after all, North Korea that we're dealing with, and destroying our expectations or disappointing us in profound ways is what they seem to do for a living. We also need, to be very frank with you, to keep in mind that there are limits to what North and South Korea can do together. We saw that during the Lee Myung-bak administration. North Korea was not willing to engage South Korea on the terms that South Korea had laid out. North Korea was not willing to engage South Korea in dealing with fundamental security issues such as nuclear weapons and missiles. The North Koreans, as a rule, preferred to talk to the United States about those issues, believing, as they do, that if they can make progress with the United States, whether it's on nuclear weapons or missile issues, that somehow the United States will drag South Korea and Japan along at the end of the day. Talks are possible between South and North. We'll see how North Korea reacts. North Korea tends to look at South Korea as fundamentally a provider of assistance, a provider of agricultural support, fertilizer, food, and occasionally over the years even cash. But as we have seen from the suspension of work at the Kaesong Industrial Complex inside North Korea, just across the border from South Korea, that project is now on ice. And the fact that the North Koreans have withdrawn their workers from it raises some very interesting questions about whether North Korea, whether Pyongyang is any longer interested in the income stream, roughly about $90 million a year that project used to generate for them. The North, as a result of removing their workers, is now not going to get that $90+ million a year, which means that some 53,000 North Korean workers who were working there, plus the 200,000 or 300,000 family members of theirs who were also dependent on the income that they were getting and the other benefits, such as food and electricity and clothing and heat, etc. And choco pies. Those benefits will not be accruing to North Korea anymore, and that raises another very interesting question. The North Koreans, as a result of the Kaesong project, probably have 53,000 North Korean citizens in their midst who are not very happy that they are no longer employed and clothed and well-fed and well-showered and medical care, etc., and plus all those hundreds of thousands of family members. This raises a very interesting question about whether North Korea is going to be able to keep those people happy, not that North Korea worries too much about keeping its people happy. There are some interesting indicators if we're asking about why that project is no longer moving forward. There are some interesting indicators that suggest that the North Koreans were indeed concerned about the potential pollution, if you will, spiritual and political pollution that the project was producing inside North Korea. And that was one of the reasons that some elements in North Korea were prepared to forego the income, because they saw that the downside of allowing that project to go forward was to allow this political and spiritual and intellectual pollution to spread into other parts of North Korea. I mentioned in the opening few moments of my remarks that we've been through a difficult patch in dealing with North Korea, and I don't have to remind you of some of the outrageous rhetoric and threats that we've heard from North Korea in recent months. But there are some very interesting signs that we've now moved into a new stage of this crisis. The bombast, the rhetoric, the threats of imminent nuclear holocaust throughout the Pacific, we're not hearing that right now, suggesting that we are moving into a new phase. And I would only remind you that if you look back over the history of our efforts to deal with North Korea, we have seen a very interesting pattern develop over the years, going back to the 80s and 90s, actually. A pattern involving an opening phase of provocation and tension, followed by a period of negotiation, followed by an agreement in which North Koreans directly or indirectly receive some rewards or benefits, followed by quiet, followed by a breakdown in the agreement, followed by more provocations and more tensions. So one probably could ask at this point, are we moving into the next phase of that cycle again, or is something else going on? And that's something we can discuss during the Q&A period. There may be some other reasons why North Korea has decided to tone down the rhetoric and cool off the temperature a little bit. Anybody who knows and has been to North Korea, and I've been there a number of times, knows that there's the annual ritual that takes place in April and May of every year, where hundreds of thousands of North Korean soldiers leave their barracks and go not to the front lines, but to the fields to engage in weeding and planting and agricultural work. And without that labor out in the fields, the North Koreans would not be able to eat at all later on this year. So it's a critical component of the North Korean economy, getting those soldiers back into the fields. And if those soldiers are on the front lines, if North Korea is ratcheting up tensions, if North Korea is running exercises, et cetera, those soldiers are not doing that duty, but they're doing military duty. Another reason for the toning down of the rhetoric and the ramping down of the temperature might be that it's difficult for North Korea, with its limited resources, to continue the operational tempo of its military, to continue those exercises, to continue flying those airplanes, to respond to what we're doing for a lengthy period of time. So it's possible that the North Koreans were compelled to calm things down because it was getting difficult to keep those planes moving in the air and to keep the tanks and other things running around to show us that they were ready to take us on in some sort of military confrontation. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the temperature seems to be a bit lower on the peninsula right now, we cannot rule out the possibility of another North Korean provocation, to be very frank with you. I hope, when I speak about provocation, that the North Koreans understand that South Korea today is a very different place from South Korea just a few years ago. There is no doubt in my mind, and probably no doubt in the minds of South Korean citizens, that the next conventional military provocation that North Korea engages in will be met with a commensurate military response by South Korea. I hope North Korea understands that. I also hope that North Korea appreciates the importance of the recent agreement that was concluded between Washington and Seoul, in which the two governments have agreed on how to respond together to the next military provocation by North Korea. A very important agreement that was achieved, and the implications of that are profound in terms of there being a joint effort to respond to whatever the North Koreans do next. My own guess, and this is just my own guess, is that if North Korea does engage in future provocative behavior, we're more likely to see it in the area of a nuclear test or a missile test. They have made it very clear that they intend to move forward very quickly in missile and nuclear weapons development. And so I think it's more a matter of when, not if, in terms of a nuclear and missile test. If a test occurs of a nuclear weapon or a missile, I think we will find, as we have in recent weeks, we will find Washington and Seoul on the same page, together with Tokyo, I suspect. But this raises a very interesting question about the role of China in all of this, and that's something that did not come up in any big way in the earlier panel, and just wanted to make a couple of points along these lines, and that is China's role going forward, I think, is still open to some question. There's no doubt that there have been some critical things said of North Korea by some Chinese officials, indirect, but it was very clear who the Chinese officials were talking about. We've seen a number of Chinese academics, including some who are very well connected in Chinese Communist Party circles, say some things that are very critical of North Korea. We have seen more and more Chinese North Korea experts advocating for a major shift in China's policy towards North Korea, its policy of almost open-ended support and tolerance for North Korea's outrageous behavior. But I would really caution you, and this is one takeaway I hope you will leave the room with, and please feel free to question me on this. I hope you would not overinterpret the changes that we're seeing in China's posture on North Korea. It's not clear that China's leadership, the core leadership, is prepared to fundamentally change its relationship with the DPRK, with North Korea. It is far from clear that the long-standing pillars of China's North Korea policy, and I think many of you are familiar with these, but among those pillars is China's desire to maintain North Korea as sort of a buffer, keeping South Korea, keeping U.S. troops far away from its borders. There are long-standing fraternal and party and, back in the past, ideological ties between North Korea and China. China has long felt a lot more comfortable with the notion of a divided Korean peninsula rather than a united Korean peninsula. And quite frankly, there are some in Beijing, and I've met with some who've actually said this to me, that they like the idea of North Korea existing as sort of a burr under the saddle of the United States in the region. Just think of how many troops and how many American military assets are tied down because North Korea exists. That's probably good news to some people in Beijing. Is China about to do a 180-degree about-face on its North Korea policy? I suspect not. Is China probably going to be somewhat more helpful, including on the implementation of sanctions? I suspect so. But I am not expecting a fundamental turnabout in China's North Korea policy. But a key element of U.S. ROK, U.S.-South Korea coordination going forward, since that's the topic of our panel here, is how to understand China's position, its evolving position on North Korea, and how to influence it in ways that are more conducive to the direction that we would like to see China move in, and how to convince China's leadership, as some Chinese academics and experts have already been convinced, that North Korea is no longer a net strategic asset of China's. It's actually a net strategic liability. There are increasing numbers of Chinese who agree with that statement, but I'm not sure that large numbers of the Chinese Politburo Standing Committee agree with that. Another central task for the United States and South Korea going forward, since we're talking about coordination, is how to deal with the disturbing, emerging new reality that we face in terms of North Korea's growing nuclear and missile capabilities. And I think a lot of you are familiar with the details here, but just in a word, North Korea has made it clear that it's not going to give up its nuclear weapons. North Korea has made it clear that it is determined to expand those capabilities. In the not-too-distant future, most American experts who study this subject agree that North Korea will have the ability to deliver nuclear warheads on virtually every major population center in East Asia, including every U.S. military base in the Western and Central Pacific, and ultimately will be able to strike parts of the Western United States with those capabilities, in the view of some experts, in about 4, 5, or 6 years' time. And I don't need to remind you that North Korea, in its recent statements and its bombast, threatened to do exactly that. North Korea has said it will use nuclear weapons against South Korea, against Japan, against the United States. Some experts believe that North Korea may already be able to deliver nuclear warheads on areas just east of North Korea, Japan, U.S. bases in Japan, South Korea. It may already be able to deliver nuclear warheads to targets in those areas using some of its medium-range ballistic missiles. There is some disagreement within the American intelligence community on this, but I side with those who believe that North Korea may already have developed a crude capability to do that. As allies, I think a key question that arises for the United States and the ROK is, how are we going to deal with this emerging threat? The threat that we will face not only in the next few months, but in the next several years from North Korea, a threat of a larger and more dangerous North Korean nuclear and missile program, as well as the proliferation threat that North Korea has posed and will continue to pose. Let me just wrap up by just saying that the current U.S. policy towards North Korea, which has been very carefully coordinated with our South Korean and Japanese allies, is based on a number of elements, including strengthening greatly economic sanctions on North Korea, increasing the pressure on North Korea, not only through sanctions, but increased military exercises, increasing the scope of some of our military exercises, anti-missile deployments in the region. We've talked about that already a little bit. Measures that are being taken against the North Korean banking system, which we believe will have a significant negative impact on North Korea. All of those things taken together may cause North Korea to return to negotiations and may convince North Korea that its best option is to begin once again to implement its commitments to rid itself of nuclear weapons. But maybe those things will not be effective in doing so. And if that's the case, if North Korea does not agree in the future to give up its nuclear weapons program, if it is serious in the rhetoric that we've been hearing for the last 3 or 4 years, that is determined to become a de facto nuclear weapons state, and some believe like it already is, what is to be done? What is the U.S. and ROK alliance going to do about that day when it comes in the not too distant future? That is indeed one of the toughest questions to face the U.S.-ROK alliance. It's a question that will be with us for a while, but it's a question that we better begin answering in the immediate future. Thank you very much.
Well, it shows how brilliant and excellent the Evans Review is, and I do really appreciate what you have presented to us. And now I go to Jung-Chan Park, who is recently president of Yonhap. Yes, Mr. Park.
Thank you, Mr. Pong. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here with you and share the time. It's very nice for me. It's in particular, I met Mr. Revere once again. We met when he was in Seoul as a deputy ambassador. And I think it's when I was managing editor, and we got together on the Jeju Island, and we played golf. And on the windy day, I do not remember the score he hit. Yeah. Anyway, he told me just before that his golf skill is very, very improved. Most of my prepared parts are similar to Mr. Revere. Anyway, I prepared some short comments for your convenience. You know why. Okay, I will read some points. Then I will be back to comment or to discuss. As you all are aware, of the past 2 decades, the North Korea policies of the two governments, South Korea and the United States, have followed a predictable pattern. So has North Korea's attitudes, as Mr. Revere pointed out properly. There was a cycle of North Korean provocations, negotiations, and rewards, then a breakdown of deals, followed by renewed provocations and renegotiations. For South Korea and the United States, it was a period during which they used the dialogue and the pressure selectively in a two-track approach. But the Allies failed to curb North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, and the capability of North Korea of nuclear development is now going into the new dimension. Most recently, Mr. Lee Myung-bak and Barack Obama administrations maintained the so-called denuclearization opening 3000 plan and the strategic patience policy on North Korea, respectively. But those strategies have borne no fruit. North Korea has continued to enhance its nuclear capability. In the March 14 column, the well-known Washington Post columnist David Ignatius said the Obama administration has alternatively wooed and threatened North Korea for 4 years with no discernible effect. A more accurate evaluation of U.S. policy would be failure. And William Perry, the former defense secretary, came to Seoul earlier this year, and Yonhap News and Stanford University hosted a joint symposium on North Korea and Northeast Asia. And William Perry, who himself involved in the Korean William Perry process, which is an initiative for to solve the North Korea problem, said this is one of the biggest failure in the diplomatic history. So far, I think it seemed to me that we could take the horse to the river, but we couldn't make North Korea to drink the water. But we cannot give up. It's really time for a creative and more effective North Korea policy. First of all, I think South Korea and the U.S. should conduct a thorough and cool-headed review of North Korea policy over the past 20 years. Certainly, the fundamental problem is North Korea's unrelenting nuclear ambitions. But South Korea and the United States should concede that their North Korea policy has lacked continuity and consistency. We have to abandon a black or white approach without yielding to North Korea unconditionally. We cannot let North Korea keep threatening the world with formidable nuclear weapons, but military confrontation is not the answer. There is still a chance for productive talks. The Park-Geun-hye-Obama summit have not come up with new concrete suggestions, but I think this summit paved the way for the new initiative. Even if the negotiations are not resumed, if negotiations are resumed, sanctions and the pressure on North Korea should not be discontinued. It is important to seek various ways to put pressure on Pyongyang to make it feel the pinch, and as did the U.S. sanctions on Banco Delta Asia in 2005, which apparently caught the North Korea leadership off guard. Secondly, working with China is important. South Korea and the United States did not necessarily have to consider China's position during the first nuclear crisis on the peninsula in 1990s. But now, we cannot get any results without China's help. We must create the conditions under which North Korea cannot keep changing their course regardless of their will. That requires more active diplomacy rather than waiting until North Korea changes. That's all I prepared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Panel 2, we're having Evans Revere and Park Jung-Chan. Now it goes to Chang-gi Kim, the president and publisher of Chosun Weekly and publications. Mr. Kim?
Okay, thank you. Before beginning my presentation, let me just clarify one thing about myself. I'm not the publisher of the Chosun Ilbo itself, but I'm merely in charge of a small affiliate company of the Chosun Ilbo, which publishes, as he said, just that, Chosun Weekly and Monthly Chosun, etc.
You're not the owner of the... Okay, go ahead, whatever.
You're promoting everybody.
I seem to be promoting everybody here. Okay, go ahead.
Even though I'm not a policy expert, but as a journalist, I want to share some of my thoughts on dealing with North Korea, and especially on our North Korea policy of South Korea and the United States, of course. I want to discuss about some confusions that we've had in dealing with North Korea. The first confusion that I want to point is our wrong expectation that the problems with North Korea could be solved through dialogues and agreements. But it was not the case, as we know very well. North Korea has repealed or has nullified, has announced to have nullified several key agreements with South Korea and the United States. Included in the lists are the license for tourism business in Mountain Gumgang area that was granted to Hyundai Group in 1991, and the joint declaration of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, ratified in 1992, and the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement, ratified in 1992, and even the Armistice Treaty that was signed and ratified in 1953. These agreements were all hard achieved and really historical. Now, should we reopen dialogue with North Korea with a new hope of solving the nuclear problem? Can we suppose any new agreements this time will really be kept? On what ground should we believe that the new agreements will not be unilaterally nullified again by North Korea? Now, North Korea asserts to draw a peace treaty with the United States. But it is North Korea itself that undermines the legitimacy and persuasiveness of such an assertion because of its own records of breaking agreements. Am I saying that dialogue is useless at all? No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that we should be aware that dialogue serves only for limited objectives, for a limited time. Such objectives as just engaging North Korea through dialogue, easing tension while continuing the dialogue, and sustaining such a low-tension situation for a while. Now, the second confusion I want to point is about the regime and the people. The real face of North Korean regime is merely an autocratic family faction standing on people's sacrifice. So North Korean regime and the people have fundamental conflict of interests. They are contradictory with each other. Let me skip comparing North Korea with China and Vietnam. Anyway, the expansion of freedom and the improvement of living standard of North Korean people are hardly expectable, at least under the current regime of Kim family. We have to think deeply whether helping North Korea actually means assisting the regime that is suppressing the people, or helping the people oppressed under the regime. Being on good terms with North Korea, in other words, actually prolongs the misery and hardship of North Korean people. In the past, some South Korean governments and politicians were confused about this, I think. Even now in South Korea, there are many leftish intellectuals and liberal politicians who almost never mention about and pay attention to the misery of North Korean people, while asserting the necessity of assistance to and reconciliation with North Korean regime. They tend to boast themselves as nationalistic. But North Koreans are as many as 1/3 of all Koreans. So supporting North Korean regime, that is the main obstacle to the welfare of North Korean people, should be regarded as rather anti-nationalistic, I think. The third confusion is about peace and reunification. Most South Korean people think peaceful reunification is the utmost national task. Of course, peaceful reunification is the official policy of South Korean government. But in reality, peace and reunification have contradicting aspects with each other. Peaceful coexistence with North Korea is, in other words, continuation of divide between South and the North. And in another respect, while peaceful coexistence is one good thing, but it's also bad because it is prolonging the miserable hardship of North Korean people. So, regarding peace as the first priority is in reality disregarding the importance and urgency of reunification. So assistance to North Korea may be needed as means for certain objectives, but sustaining the regime should not be the objective. In my view, the objectives of North Korea policy in some previous South Korean administrations were just sustaining North Korean regime from collapsing and peaceful coexistence with it. Now I'm wrapping up my presentation. Our final goal should be reunification, I think, in a system with free democracy and a market economy. The government of the unified nation should be chosen by the people. That is, we should achieve reunification peacefully through talks and establish a government through unified elections. But to accomplish that final goal, we should drive first North Korea's normalization, inducing into a normal country through openness, reforms, and democratization that enables real elections. The means that we have to adopt can be persuasion and pressure. Persuasion and pressure are mutually complementary and can be adopted simultaneously. Of course, the logic for persuading North Korea should be rational, consistent with universal values, and very importantly, acceptable to China. What will that be like? We should persuade North Korea and China to believe that, to realize that the insecurity of North Korea comes not from the military forces of South Korea and the United States, but from the political and economic misery of the people within North Korea. So how could we put pressure to North Korea? I think virtually almost all of the outside aid into North Korea should be stopped unless North Korea chooses a similar course as China and Vietnam did. Especially resources that can be used for military purposes should be strictly controlled. Who can do all this? China is the country that has the most available resources, both for persuasion and pressure. Then, how to get China's cooperation for this? That's another question of international cooperation, especially between South Korea and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Any additional presentational comment from before getting questions from the floor? Evans? No? Okay. Mr. Park?
I'd like to hear from Mr. Revere about the Korea-Japan relations. And in terms of the development of South Korea-U.S. relations, I think there is a key factor we should take into account. That is Japan. And you are well read in the Japan affairs. The U.S. is focusing the efforts on bolstering trilateral cooperation with South Korea and Japan in order to counter China's growing influence in the region. But the development of Seoul-Tokyo relations have been affected by history and the Dokdo Island. How do you think South Korea should handle the Japan issue and the dilemma?
Evans?
Delicately. No, seriously. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is an important question, and it was addressed in the earlier panel. And I didn't have an opportunity to commend Gordon Flake for the excellent job he did in answering a question very similar to yours, or dealing with a concern very similar to yours. I've worked on U.S.-Japan relations actually longer than I've worked on U.S.-Korea relations, if that's possible. And I've just finished writing an article which Gordon Flake in his earlier presentation wonderfully summarized, even though he hasn't read it. And among the points that I make in the article, and I'll be very brief here, is that if you look at overall stability on the Korean Peninsula, if you look at our responsibility to defend the Republic of Korea and prevent North Korea from taking advantage of the situation in Northeast Asia, attacking South Korea, et cetera, engaging in provocations, it is physically impossible to defend the Republic of Korea without Japan, in a very practical, fundamental sense. The bases that we have in Japan, the assets that we have in Japan, the need for Japanese ports and other facilities, you could not prosecute effectively a war on the Korean Peninsula without the use of those facilities, many of which are dedicated specifically to the defense of the Republic of Korea. And if you look at it the other way, if you look at the threat that North Korea potentially poses to Japan, it's hard to imagine our ability to do an effective job in defending our Japanese allies without Korea being on side, if you will, South Korea being on side. For that reason and a lot more that I go into in an article that'll be out in just a few weeks, and I'd be happy to share a copy with KEI and distribute it to you, I argue that now more than ever, both sides, Tokyo and Japan, need to step back, take a very deep breath, and realize the implications of this downturn in relations. And also ask themselves the fundamental question, who benefits from a downturn in relations between Seoul and Tokyo? Pyongyang benefits. And to some extent, Beijing is eyeing that and saying, this is interesting. America's two major allies in Northeast Asia cannot seem to get along. And Beijing may draw, I think, the wrong conclusions from this. I go into a lot of other issues in this, but I think fundamentally the arguments are the ones that I've just made, but also the ones that Gordon Flake made a bit earlier. There is a logical and important connection between South Korea's interests and Japan's interests in Northeast Asia in terms of maintaining peace and stability. You have two major trading countries. You have two major allies. You have two major market economies, two major democracies. The things in the similarity column outnumber the things in the dissimilarity column, quite frankly. And so there's a powerful logic to trying to move beyond these issues. One cannot forget history, one cannot erase history, but one can certainly try to manage the legacy that history has left us with, and I think now more than ever is the time to do that. Let me stop there.
Good, well done. This time I like to take questions from the floor. Start from there, maybe. Why not start from Larry over there, since give him a chance.
I'm Larry Nix from CSIS. Mr. Revere made an excellent point when talking about the emergence and the rise of anti-North Korean sentiment among different elements in the Chinese body politic, but I certainly agree with his caution about expecting any really fundamental changes in Chinese policies toward North Korea. The emergence of these groups, it seems to me, is really what you might call a long-term work in progress. And I use the word work in progress, meaning what do we do about this? What does South Korea do? What does the United States do? So my question is, on that basis, are there any themes in our diplomacy towards North Korea that you could think of or perhaps highlight that would serve us in terms of attractiveness to these critics of North Korea in China? Themes in our diplomacy that would strengthen their sentiments that China should change its approach, its policies to North Korea, and perhaps bring even more adherence in China to this group of North Korean critics. Themes in our diplomacy that perhaps we currently are not giving enough emphasis to or might need to develop more fully in the future.
Good question.
All right, Evans.
You want to take other questions, or do you want? Yeah.
We're going to okay. Can you? Let's go by 1, 2. Okay.
I'm Michael Marshall from the Global Peace Foundation, also editor emeritus at UPI. Question is for Mr. Kim. You offered a very a strikingly fresh and different framework or context for viewing approach in relations to North Korea, and I have two questions relating to that. One is simply, how widespread is that sort of view that you laid out in South Korea? Is that a view that is increasingly being held there by opinion leaders? And my second question is, given that you said that our experience of negotiating with North Korea has been pretty fruitless and frustrating, why would you expect that in this context the pressure and persuasion you spoke about would be any more successful?
Thank you. All right. Let's be okay. Give me a microphone, please. Do you need? Yeah.
It seems to me that the utilization of a North Korean nuclear weapon anywhere in the world would result in the instant dismemberment of the Kim regime. As such, these weapons are essentially useless. Why doesn't the U.S. ROK alliance simply stand up and say that, to announce that the utilization of these weapons would mean the end of the Kim regime, 100% certainty? That would effectively castrate the weapons. It seems like such an easy thing, and I don't understand why we don't do that.
Okay, thanks for the question. Oh, next, right behind him.
Yeah, hi, Mike Billington again. I want to ask about Russia. There's been no mention of Russia, but as you know, Russia sort of stayed in the background during most of the six-party talks, but then a few years ago intervened quite forcefully in the north and the south with an offer for getting back to the pipeline and perhaps even the railroad as a basis of peace through development. by opposing development in the North, creating an environment in which peace would be possible. Now that, I'd like to have your view of why that has fallen apart, but sort of connected. And secondly, as you know, Abe was just in Moscow, and they're very strongly moving forward on the question of joint development of the Russian Far East. And this is something that the Russians want from Korea as well, which would bring about Korean technology and probably North Korean labor power. So this is a framework for peace separate from just political, egg throwing at each other, putting in place that kind of real prospect for growth, for benefiting all sides, and thereby making some sort of political solution possible.
Good question. Thank you. Mike, we'll be going back there. And
I'm Gil Rosman, and I have a question about China, too. It seems interesting that from two different perspectives, Korean commentators are saying, we've got to turn to China. And yet, there's been no response, really, in terms of what is China trying to do. And I've been struck by how little in Korea is written about the Chinese dispute, the Chinese effort to deal with North Korea, what their strategy is, what are the divisions. And to point to a few, as Larry just said, a few Chinese who've written critically about North Korea is not really adequate, because most of these people we know as marginalized. If you talk to them, they say, we don't have any impact on this regime, we're just taking advantage of an opportunity to write stuff. But they don't really speak for any voices that we know or any interest groups that we really can specifically designate in the leadership. So what I want to know is who actually in Korea is analyzing what China is going to do and making recommendations based on reality in China rather than, wild hopes.
good question. Any other questions from the floor? Then we go back to Evans to answer.
Want me to start?
Yeah,
Oh,
you
sure,
go ahead
sure,
first.
sure. Great questions. Larry, your point about China is very well taken. Just by way of background, I've been talking to the Chinese on and off about the Korean Peninsula since the late 70s, early 80s, quite frankly, when I was stationed there, and since many, many intense conversations with the Chinese. And I think that there has been a really significant transformation of Chinese thinking about North Korea. But we'll just repeat what I said earlier, don't take it to the bank, because I don't see a fundamental 180 shift in China's policy at this point. There is a recalibration going on, and it's a recalibration that is being compelled by the outrageousness of North Korean behavior, by the fact that North Korea is today the only country on the planet that is arguing for the use of nuclear weapons anywhere on the planet, and promising to use them under certain circumstances. This has made China nervous. The recent North Korean nuclear test took place within easy striking distance of the Chinese-North Korean border. Something, if you read Chinese blogs like I do, did not sit very well in Beijing and among the Chinese people. They were very, very unhappy at that. And for various other reasons. For example, the attack on Yonhap Island in November of 2010 seemed to have shaken up the Chinese leadership, because they saw the real prospect that we might be moving towards another peninsular war, a peninsular war in which there had been absolutely no consultation between Pyongyang and Beijing prior to, during, or even after that attack on Yonhap Island. That unnerved many, many Chinese. Your specific question about how to move the Chinese in a better direction is a very important one. I think some things that we're doing are already moving them in perhaps a more helpful direction. Keep in mind that every new military deployment that we make, every new anti-ballistic missile system and technology that moves into the region that is intended to deal with the North Korean threat, every major new movement by U.S. aircraft carrier battle group, whether it's on the east side of the peninsula or the west side of the peninsula, has implications for China's own security. All of these weapon systems, all of these exercises, all of these deployments may be intended for North Korea, but if you're sitting in Beijing and if you're a PLA planner, you have to regard all of these movements and all of these systems as potentially available for use against you as well. And so when my Chinese friends complain to me about these things that we're doing in the region, my response is, please take your complaint to Pyongyang, because it's Pyongyang's actions that are bringing these things about. That has gotten Beijing's attention. I think there are other things that we can do to get Beijing's attention as well. I think there is a role for Track 2 and Track 1.5, sort of unofficial and semi-official dialogue, in which the subject of alternative futures for the Korean Peninsula is discussed. What would a reunified Korean Peninsula look like? Would it pose any real threat to China? What sort of relationship would it have with the United States? What would be the role of U.S. forces on a reunified Korean Peninsula? Would there be a reason to have a significant U.S. military presence on the Korean Peninsula in the future if North Korea goes away? These are all subjects that the discussion of which could increase China's comfort level with the notion of a reunified Korean Peninsula. I'll stop there because I've got some other ideas, but I don't want to eat into the time. On North Korea's use of nuclear weapons. The use of nuclear weapons by North Korea would result in there being no North Korea. Not just the leadership, but other things would no doubt happen. We have said this in various fora to the North Koreans. When I was in government, I was in meetings in which this had been communicated very clearly, including by implication when I accompanied Bill Perry to Pyongyang in 1999. It was very clear in the North Korean minds what the positive scenario for U.S.-North Korea dialogue was, but also the negative scenario was in the event that they did not come back to the table and engage with us.
Why has it had no effect?
The North Koreans, in my view, do not intend to use those weapons for offensive purposes, even though they threaten to do it. These weapons are useful to get our attention, to bring us to the table, to bring our South Korean friends to the table, perhaps to bring others to the table. They are meant to intimidate. They are meant to cow. They are meant to change the balance of power. They're a very useful asymmetric tool for the North Koreans, who don't have very many other useful weapons in their quiver. The concern that I really have when it comes to nukes and North Korea is really the miscalculation factor. For example, during the recent ramping up of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, you had the North Koreans move 2 of their newer intermediate-range ballistic missiles that may have the ability to strike as far away as Guam. And as I said earlier, they could be nuclear capable in the minds of some experts. They moved those to launching positions on the east coast of the Korean Peninsula. If things had continued to heat up in this moment of tension, and the North Koreans had somehow signaled that those missiles were nuclear capable and began launch preparations, what would we have done in response to that? So there's the possibility of miscalculation. And then I also mentioned in my earlier remarks concern about proliferation. North Korea is not a potential proliferator. North Korea has a track record, by its own admission, of having proliferated nuclear-related technologies. That's another concern. 2 quick words on Russia. The Russian oil pipeline idea, gas pipeline idea, great concept. The concept of North Korea adopting Chinese-style economic reforms, also a great concept. But you'll notice that neither of these have really gone anywhere in North Korea. And you have to ask yourself, why not? The Chinese have been talking to the North Koreans about implementing Chinese-style economic reforms since at least 1982, when I was stationed in our embassy in Beijing, and my Chinese colleagues briefed me about these things. The fundamental problem for the North Koreans is that fundamental economic reform, systemic reform, would probably, in their view, spell the death of their regime. And that's why none of these things have, quite frankly, moved forward, because they have no confidence in their ability of their regime to survive the openness, the increase in unregulated economic transactions, the flow of population, the breakdown of the old order and security that would result from implementing these reforms. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Evans. And Mr. Kim and Mr. Park, Mike or Bill Rogers want to know, actually, who is handling the affairs and issues of the Korea-Chinese relations and their influence, Chinese influence upon North Korea, and that sort of thing. You want to answer? Can you speak some Chinese?
First of all, he received the question. Yeah, I know, but this is another question.
Well, who is handling India?
I understand the question, but I'm not quite prepared to answer to that question because, basically I think such an analysis would be done by South Korean government, I think. It's basically their duty, their task. So such an analysis
in the government, who is this?
In the government, by diplomats or whoever. But I'm not sure how correctly, how properly it is done. I'm not sure, but of course it should be done by the government officials and sometimes several policy experts in South Korea, I think.
Could I just?
So I'm not quite.
Could I just mention a couple of things? Keep in mind that one of the very first telephone calls that was made by President Park when she became president was to Xi Jinping, where they spoke in very good colloquial Chinese to each other. And I've dealt with many Korean diplomats over the years who have, I think, a really good sense of what's going on.
Is it true that she is in good terms with Xi Jinping?
Yes, I think so. Keep in mind that her next trip after the United States is going to be China.
I don't know.
I can't answer that question.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Let me respond to your second question first. In the frame I suggested, the main actor is China, not South Korea or United States engaging in dialogue directly with North Korea. But what I suggested is let us persuade first China to exert pressure or persuade North Korea to move ahead to a normal country, to become a normal country. So this is not just directly engaging dialogues with North Korea that can be nullified any time. So this is not a repetition of that model, I think. And the reason why I want China is useful is, as I said, China is the country that has the most asset, most resources that can really move North Korea. That is why I suggested that pressure and persuasion model. And regarding to your first question, I don't think the views that I presented here is that widely held in South Korea. Probably I think quite many people would even think that such a view is merely a view of an ultra-right columnist or ultra-right journalist or whatever. I think my view would not be that widespread in South Korea.
I do not enter into that discussion, but I have to mention the question regarding the international cooperation, including Russia. I think the Russians also have to join the international cooperation. I think it was more than 20 years ago when I was at the Senate hearing. I'm not sure he's alive or not. Don Jagoria.
Very much alive.
Yeah. At that time, he was quite Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Okay, and he said the concentric conception is the to solve the Korean problem, Korean Peninsula problems. The inter-Korean relations are very, very important, and the more surrounding nations are also important. But the reason why he focused on the concentric means that at that time the efforts were focused on the outside efforts. So I think that this is time the interrelated, interdependent efforts are being made, should be being made. And when a bird comes out, there needs is effort inside the small bird, and outside the mother bird also strike the egg with the beak. I think I'm not sure it's a proper comparison.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think what I think is that there should be joint efforts inside the Korean Peninsula, inter-Korean relations, and the outside countries, including Russia.
Very good.
Okay.
Can the moderator ask any question to panelists? Am I allowed?
You are our great leader.
All right. Evan, so you're half Korean, half American. I'd like to ask, how successful do you think it was on the Park and Obama summit this time?
Extremely successful.
This much or this much?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I think this was pretty close to a 10, if not a 10. I think, as I said, the chemistry between the two leaders. Having sat in on my share of summits between our president and leaders around the world, you cannot underestimate the importance of that contact, the trust, the chemistry, the ability to look across the table and think that this is a person that I can do business with and have confidence with, and of course it flows back in the other direction as well. And I think by that standard, this was clearly a big success.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Moderator, I have a question about you.
Yes, sir.
You served the two-time chairman of the Congress Foreign Relations Committee. What do you think is the best government to handle the North Korea problems?
My wife is here. Well, I'll close this session right now. I quit. That's why I quit the chairmanship. I want to thank everybody who joined us today to assess the U.S.-Korea relationship looking forward, and especially when I had Dr. Louis Goodman, a good friend of ours, 23 years dean of SIS, American University, and who really helped us to establish this kind of regular annual seminars along with us, as well as a Golden Flake. He speaks better Korean than you do, right?
My wife accuses me of having a North Korean accent, but that's okay.
I'm from North Korea myself, my wife, and but I do really appreciate what he had the comment on the Korean Peninsula, and Mr. Chansun Nam, our club secretary from 동아일보, and Chang-gi Kim, former president of NBC Masan, and Abraham Kim, who had to leave for another meeting in Texas, so he's not here right now, but I do appreciate what he has done for us all along. And once again, I'd like to present to him, Evans Revere, to you, who is really who has done a marvelous job in Korea, and as well as at the president of Korea Society, he really cemented the bridge between Seoul and Washington. I want to ask you gentlemen to give him and Mr. Park, Park Jung-Chan, who sort of really inaugurated own the Y television, called Y television, using all the worldwide correspondent into Y television, which is very, very fast growing in Korea. For that matter, I want to give a big hand too. And Chang-gi Kim, the publisher of Chosun Weekly, but he's not the owner, but he acts like the owner. But I want to give him the big hand too. So thank everybody. One more thing. He's my one of the members there, Charlie Chen, our first president of Kwanun Press Club, who was AP bureau chief in Korea. Charlie. Anybody else who is running for Congress or anything? Okay. This will close our session here, and I do appreciate what you have done for us and for your coming, at least, and we will looking forward better relationship that will be established by the summit between Obama and Park Geun-hye. Thank you and good evening. Bye. Okay.